Okay, thank you, Kustub, for that, for explaining those kind of data. And as Kustub explained, we really need to understand the habitat mask or the integration space and to really define it. It's central for SCR. So we're going to go through a few principles in terms of defining this, because if we don't get this right, we can really bias our estimates or inflate it, as you'll see in the following slides. So first of all, I want to ask you guys, what is a mask? So what does it represent? And there are different terms. There's terms mask, there's buffers, integration space, so it can get quite confusing. So we'll go over some of these one by one. So first, a mask represents the habitat in the vicinity of the camera traps that is potentially occupied by our snow leopards or our species of interest. And it equates to the area of integration that we can use for analysis. Yeah, so it's all the potential areas where you can find snow leopards. So ideally, you don't want this integration space to be massive and infinity. It could be infinity, but then we would be assuming that the area we're sampling here actually represents potentially the other areas that we haven't sampled that is, very far from our camera trap area. And if we don't have covariates to maybe model that variation, we'd be assuming the exact same density or abundance. So it's important to think ecologically, okay, what makes ecological sense, and have a smaller kind of integration space or mask around our camera trap area. Another thing to think about is the larger the mask, the longer time it's going to take to analyze your data. So if you remember, what is a mask made out of? We shared this in some of the first presentations on SCR, and it's made out of pixels. So we can say that the mask is made out of each kind of pixel, and you can see each X is almost like the center of that pixel. Yeah, and the size of this pixel will define the resolution of your mask. So if you have very tiny pixels, maybe, for example, with the diameter of 100 meters, you would have very small a resolution of your mask, and that would influence your histogram and the analysis of your SCR estimates. While if you had a very much larger resolution of each pixel, that would also influence the analysis and of your study. So it's about finding that pixel size that makes, again, ecological sense and relates again to your question about what you're trying to ask. So if you're trying to ask about the abundance or in your study area, what size of each pixel makes sense for snow leopards. In our case, we kind of think maybe around 500 meters squared. There's other studies that have chosen, for example, 1 kilometer squared or 1.5 kilometers squared. And that's normally a size that's big enough to say, okay, a snow leopard is using this area, and we're going to assess the density for each pixel. And it's density, but it's really what we talked about, the activity center for that pixel. And that's what we're trying to assess over the entire mask. And another way to think about it is each X of our mask is an area which potentially could have an activity center for your snow leopard. So that's something to think about when you create your mask. So I hope that makes sense. So if we understand our mask as many pixels that represent the integration space, what is the mask for? Well, it can do many things. First of all, it can help us distinguish from areas that are snow leopard potential habitats and areas that are non-habitats. When we say non-habitats, we mean 0 probability of finding snow leopards in those areas. It's not low probability, it's actually 0, almost like impossible that they would actually be there, and we can define that in our mask. Another thing that it helps us do is it define the outer layer of how far. Okay, we can have a large mask, but then we can actually decide on the buffer and the actual integration area, integration space that we put into the SCR analysis and assess density, which is within that mask normally. So that's the difference between a buffer and a mask itself. Finally, which Kustub will share later today, the mask helps us define the covariates for density. So we can have information, for example, of elevation at each pixel, or information about prey density potentially. You could have modeled, or anything that you're interested in assessing related to density for each pixel, and then assess that relationship later in your model. So we'll go into that a bit later. But first, let's go back to this lovely example from Mongolia. If you remember, this is in the South Gobi. The altitude ranges between 1,600 and 2,400 meters. It's not very high, but in the mountain areas that are there, it's very rugged and has steep cliff, mountainous, rocky habitat where snow leopards and where ibex are found. And then these areas are kind of surrounded by flat desert steppe, which is not snow leopard habitat. So this whole area here, as you might remember, is around 5,000 kilometers squared. So we can't really, in one camera trap survey, cover the entire area. So we're going to select part of it, and we're going to select this bottom southwest area, which is tossed, which we have done. We've done camera trapping in all of these areas, but we do them in different sessions. So this is one session related to tossed. So first of all, when thinking about the tossed area, we're going to think, okay, let's define our mask and define what areas are actual habitat for snow leopards and what areas are non-habitat for snow leopards. So we have several options. One option, I'm just saying based on, we don't really know the area and we're just going to define the mask. If we don't know the area, we might say, okay, our camera traps are here in red, these red kind of crosses. We're going to assume all of the habitat within that camera trap array and surrounding that camera trap array is potential habitat for snow leopards. So every single pixel, and here it's defined at 500 meters squared, every 500 meters squared in this area, large area, potentially can have snow leopards. And we're going to tell SCR that this is the case, and that's our assumption. Alternatively, we could do something else, and we could say, actually, we know that there are two rivers going through our study area, and these two rivers are seen in white. Here you can see, maybe you can see my mouse going through. There are two rivers, or even three potentially, and we're going to say, okay, around our camera trap areas is snow leopard habitat, and we do find snow leopards, but then further away from them, there's no, snow leopards do not go in rivers. I mean, they can travel through rivers, and that's not what we're assessing, but they don't, we're not going to assess how many snow leopards are there in the 500 meters squared of our river, because we'd assume there are 0 snow leopards living there continuously, right, during our trap session. So, and that's why it's white, and we don't include it in our analysis, because there's 0 probability of a snow leopard being in that 500 meter squared pixel. So, but then another alternative is almost the kind of the medium alternative, we can say. We assume within the camera trap array, there it is snow leopard habitat, and we do find snow leopards, but outside there's a kind of hard boundary, and outside there's 0 probability of snow leopards being there, almost like they're on an island. The island that you can have snow leopards, outside, no possibility a snow leopard will be there. So these are 3 kind of examples that one could take depending on your understanding of the area. And you can see that depending on how you define that mask, it influences your abundance. Your density might be similar in the analysis, and Kustub will show some examples of that later, but the absolute density, which is often what people are interested in, for example, how many snow leopards in your PA, it changes according to how you defined where there is habitat and where there isn't habitat, non and potential and 0 habitat. So I hope that makes sense. So that's the first step that helps you do. So it's really important to determine where snow leopards are or not. And let's go back to the actual example. In this case, this real case study, we do know that there is steppe around these mountains, and that is non-habitat. We would assume that snow leopards do not occur there at all throughout the year. They might use it and cross it potentially, but that doesn't matter. That's not what we're trying to assess. We're not going to assess density for areas that they potentially cross. while areas of mountain area are snow leopard habitat, and we can define that as as our mask. So now I want to ask you guys, just to make sure that we really understand what is areas that could be non-habitat that we would exclude from our mask. And if you can write in the comment section other kind of examples that we would exclude from our mask, because there are other examples that are commonly used throughout the snow leopard range that I haven't talked about. So Kustub, if you're there, if you can help me and use your magical whiteboard powers of writing on the screen, it would be great.
I'm right here. Let me see if I can annotate though.
And let's see if anyone in the chat can start writing. Desert areas. Yes, Artsana has written desert areas that might be, so desert steppe. So yeah, just like the Mongolia example, desert steppe we would exclude. I guess we have to think of this. It's desert areas that are bigger than 500 meters squared in our study area. Yeah, bigger than our pixel size, which is important caveat to think about. Ranjana, great point. Areas with elevation greater than 6,000 meters. Yes, if often snow leopards don't travel up to that area, and we might know from occupancy in our area that there aren't snow leopards higher than that. So we could put the disregard elevations all over a certain altitude and say that is non-habitat. Good point. Kustub, are you managing to write or?
Oh, you can't see it?
No.
What? Come on. I am right. What is happening? I am able to, it's showing that I'm annotating. Let me see. Annotate, yeah.
Maybe. Ah, there it is. It's there.
It's there now?
Yeah, really nice.
Okay.
Thanks. Here we've got a question from Helena.
High or low altitude? Yeah, you're right about that, Helena, which is why we try to usually take a little bit of a buffer on both sides. I mean, in India, for example, we take the altitude up to 5,200 or 5,300 meters, but that's, let's say, around Spiti. The moment you move further down in latitude, let's say you go to Bhutan, you might have snow leopards using slightly higher altitudes. But even when we say it's 5,200 meters, for our analysis, we really try to take it a little wider than that. And the only key there is that if you are taking your altitudinal range to be, let's say, 6,000 meters, then there should be some cameras at that altitude as well. Because if you don't have any camera traps, and if you've just increased your width there, then the software will have no means to project or to predict what is happening as the altitude increases. And Justine, if I may just take a minute just to remind of what we did in one of the data sets that we analyzed with our friend Madhu Chetri from Nepal. You can see there is a very nice publication that came out about a year ago, actually, where Madhu's data from almost 12,000 square kilometers using genetic sampling, it really indicated very distinctly that, because his data covered a wide range of altitudes, right? His transects covered low altitude, high altitude, moderate altitude, and so on. And it was becoming more and more evident, and it became evident, and eventually we were able to test the hypothesis that snow leopards use a range of altitude which is neither too high nor too low. So there is a high density of snow leopards at a moderate altitude. What that moderate altitude is, we don't tell the software. We estimate it empirically based on data, but we provided a possibility of a model, let's say a quadratic function, where as the value of altitude increases, the density increases. But as the value of altitude increases further, at a certain point in time, density starts decreasing. So these are the kind of hypotheses you can test, but the only condition there is you should have your traps, your sampling should cover that area. Even if you get nothing, you should then have some samples from that area. Only then can you make that hypothesis. You can test that hypothesis. Otherwise, you'll just have to live that I have no idea whether there are snow leopards there or not. And then you create a cutoff. Sorry, over to you, Justine.
No, that's great, because just making assumptions out of the blue can, yeah, it's good to have that. And you can, yeah, also do larger scale occupancy, right, Kustu, for these larger high altitude.
Totally.
I mean, you can't necessarily model it within your SCR, but you get a kind of understanding. Absolutely. It will be hard to know the cutoff though, exactly.
No,
but
absolutely.
We have another thing from FDCAR saying human interferenced areas. Yeah, so potentially villages or cities. Nowadays, there are increasingly large urban sprawled areas near snow leopard habitats. So yes, we would want to indicate that. So Kustu, if you can add that, that would be great.
Can you see it again? I don't know why my annotations don't show up.
I think it takes maybe some time to do it. And then, so there are still others, like we talked about rivers. So here it's come up, Kustu. So we talked about rivers. There also could be lakes, big lakes that potentially you would want to also include as non-habitat. And someone mentioned last time fences, for example, and just to clarify, you know, often fences will be more of a barrier, right? That doesn't mean that it's non-habitat within that 500 meter squared pixel. So that's a kind of a different issue that one might be focusing on. But maybe there's a huge, like the bordered fence area, like I don't know, some countries have big bordered fences that stop actually snow leopards from moving to one area to the other side, and it's pretty sure from color data that they don't move across. So then that other side of that country could be considered non-habitat for that snow leopard population. Right, Kustub, any other
Absolutely.
ideas?
No, that's a very good point, Justine, you mentioned. So if your snow leopards can't cross a certain barrier, and you have evidence that, yes, you're right, you can make that evidence. Like if there is a big fence, as you rightly said, Justine, or if there is a very fast moving river, maybe you can call them as hard boundaries. You will have to have a cutoff. Beyond that, the animals don't move. But remember one more thing, that snow leopards do tend to have a good ability to swim. We used to believe snow leopards don't swim, but we've got so many pictures in the last few years of completely drenched snow leopards, with almost as if coming out of a bathtub. And they've been crossing rivers, and our camera traps have also revealed them crossing rivers. Incidentally, in Kyrgyzstan, some telemetry data has also confirmed that snow leopards do cross rivers pretty regularly, even in the seasons when you would assume that they may not be crossing over. So that's another important issue one may need to consider.
Yeah, and just like the desert steppe, they could cross it. So if your island mountain is kind of separated from the other mountain island by just maybe a few kilometers necessarily, but the population could be continuous, you could mark that area of desert as non-habitat, but include the other continuous mountains in your study area.
Totally.
That's a good point. Okay, so thank you, everyone. These are really great. I hope that seems that everyone kind of understands this non-habitat issue. So we'll move on to maybe I have to erase all your beautiful markings. Yes.
There we go.
Thank you. Okay. Oh my God, I'm writing things now. Okay. Mouse. So now the second thing that we talked about, which was related. Okay, one is it helps you define habitat and non-habitat. Second, it helps you define the buffer. So the buffer is the actual area of integration that informs your SCR. So the mass can be wider than the actual buffer, but the buffer is actually what is used and where you calculate your density for each pixel. So habitat beyond, how do we define what the buffer is? So if you remember, some of you from last session, we discussed how one assumptions that we make when defining this buffer is that animals that are outside of our camera trap, or outside of our buffer, do have no chance of being detected on our camera traps, if that makes sense. So our buffer is wide enough to include the sigmas of all those individuals which we captured in our camera traps. I hope that makes sense. But this still doesn't answer how large do we define it? So we're gonna go through it. Back to our example from Mongolia. And, you know, one might think, okay, so our mask is all of the mountain kind of rugged area. So we could define that as our entire integration space. But the actual rule of thumb is to actually make our integration space wide enough so that there's no bias in our kind of density estimate. And this is related to the information on our species that we capture, the individuals that we capture. So you want to have a small enough buffer that it doesn't result in a positive bias in your abundance estimate. The penalty of using a larger buffer is less of a penalty, but it will cause slower kind of analysis, as we discussed earlier. So what we often say as a rule of thumb is actually to take a buffer at first of 4 sigmas. So you try to understand, okay, after you've collected all your data from your population, you can estimate your potential sigma for your population. And you can take 4 of those sigmas and use that as a potential buffer that is big enough that you haven't positively biased your population. However, this is a bit arbitrary, 4 sigmas. So then what you can do is take this estimate, you can use the 4 sigmas to run your SCR model and get estimates of other estimates of sigma of lambda, and then run that to get an estimated buffer length. So I know that might sound a bit complicated. I think it will make more sense maybe when Kustub explains some of the R code and the different steps that you do in R. But for now, just think about it. You need to have a buffer that's big enough so that you include, you include all of the sigmas of your population within your study area. So for example, back to our population in Mongolia, in this case, we had a population with a sigma of 6 kilometers. Therefore, at first, we took a suggested buffer of around 23 kilometers or 24. And then we derived what the suggested buffer was, and it was around 23 kilometers. And this is, as you can see here, in the 23 kilometers buffer around our study area. But what if we had, and it gave an estimate around 18 snow leopard individuals with that confidence interval. But what if we had initially had a population with a much larger sigma, for example, 12 sigma? Then we might have taken and calculated initial suggested buffer of 48 kilometers, and it would have been this wider kind of gray area. And this would have had a much larger population of snow leopards. So if we had arbitrary, for this same population that was initially shown here, if we had arbitrarily decided, actually we're gonna have a much larger buffer and chosen 48, it might have inflated our abundance because we would have included a much larger area of our study. I hope that, I mean, that might not make complete sense, so I'll let Kustub after explain it again so that it hopefully makes sense. But I wanted to highlight here again, you can see, okay, there's desert steppe in between these 2 mountain ranges. But we are assuming that the population is continuous and they could move between this one mountain island with the other mountain island. So there's not a hard boundary between these 2 mountains. So let's go to another example that we discussed last time. So Kustub, I could request some of your help here again. And I wanted to ask you guys, in this case, in Spiti, where we had a more continuous population of snow leopards at a very kind of high altitude, around 5,000 meters, with these kind of river valleys, how would we first define non-habitat versus habitat? So we do those for the step by step to define our mask. Please note that these grids are much larger than our actual pixel cells would be in our mask, and our pixels would be much smaller at 500 meters squared, as we showed in the Mongolia example. So what are some potential non-habitat from this area that we could use? The river. Okay, yeah, if the river, I'm not so familiar with the area, but Kustub, if there are rivers that do occupy a whole pixel, we could define it as non-habitat.
Fair enough. So Ranjana, the only thing you might need to recollect here is that a mask or an integration space defines a range of points where snow leopards can have their activity centers, right?
Yeah.
Now, if a river is smaller than 500 meters in width, then the chances of a snow leopard having an activity center in the middle of the river are fairly low. You might end up just missing it by chance, and half a kilometer of a river width is pretty big, right? So that's one thing. You may or may not do a fatal error by doing that. However, if your river is such that it becomes a barrier for snow leopards from moving from east to west or west to east, or as in Spiti they call the right bank to left bank and left bank to right bank, then that will become a border, a hard border, as Justine was explaining with the step. Here you will have to create a hard border with the river, if that is the case. So that's how you need to look at it. Any space that an animal cannot have an activity center in is what we should exclude from the mask.
So then that's why often it's more lakes, for example, that are much larger spatially than necessary, sometimes rivers. But we can write that down, Ranjana, and I think it's good to add those caveats, whether it's hard border, whether it's based on, and whether it's potentially is a big, large river, which can't have an activity center, whether it's a hard border, or because otherwise, if it's a small river and it still can be an activity center, we should include it because it still has a potential. There still is a probability snow leopards could occur there. Okay, any other thoughts? I mean, this is, you can't really see it, but it's very high in elevation. It goes up to 6,400. I see some indications. So, so that might be something to also consider.
So Helena, yes, river speed and depth could change, and you can treat it year by year. In 1 year, you know that the river is impermeable. In fact, look at it as a season. You know, in some season, you might, if you're sampling in the winters, when the river is frozen, then the river's presence almost doesn't matter to the snow leopards. So if you're sampling in the winter, then your river will not have an impact. But if you're sampling in the summer, the river may have an impact. In 1 year, there might be less impact. In another year, there might be more. So yes, you can test these variations and analyze your data accordingly. Okay, so Justine had a very good point. Anybody about altitude? Do you think there is a possibility there? Would you like to exclude or include a certain altitude or range, or would you like to put everything as a sampling effort? Excellent. Low or high altitude. Yeah, that's a good point. Great. So sorry, Justine, over you.
No, I was just going to mention, often one thing we haven't mentioned is forested areas. Some people will include dense forested areas. Maybe it's also correlated with lower elevation as non-habitat, and that can be the case. You know, snow leopards are not going to find in very dense, lower elevated forests. However, forest patches, which maybe or continuous forest patches, but in some cases, there have been indications that snow leopards do use some of the more shrubby or less dense forests. So that's just something to keep in mind. Yeah, Kustup, go for it.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect.
I don't know. I don't think this area has huge
Doesn't
forest,
have much of a forest, yeah.
but maybe the
Okay.
lower elevated areas.
Right.
But
There's
I think
another
that's
point.
yeah, go for it, Kustup.
So there's another point that came in, which is about snow or precipitation, depending on season of sample. How do you think, Helena, would snow or precipitation affect impermeability of a lands or of a space? I mean, snow leopards are snow leopards, right? So, okay, fine. Yeah. So again, I mean, here, look at it this way. Don't try not to confuse it with movement at this point in time. Look at it as a yes. I mean, if you think in a certain area, there is no way a snow leopard can have an activity center, and an activity center is not a place where where you have, I mean, where you have to be physically present all the time. It could be a mathematical activity center, a centroid of a few points around that area as well. So yes, if you think snow cover can have an effect, that's something different. But to just consider that because of snow, an area might become completely inaccessible. If there is a situation like that, maybe you might want to add a or exclude that from your integration space.
So
What do
that
other people think, those who have been working in the snow leopard habitat? Do you think snow cover might have an effect, or can we exclude areas with high snow cover if we are already excluding areas of high and low altitude? Do you think we should exclude snow cover as well? Exactly. Yeah, Helena, that's a good point. It's actually a covariate than a mask determinant. Good.
But for example, as some people mentioned last session, Kustup, huge glaciers, for example, might
Yeah, very
be
good point. Yeah.
continuous glaciers. There are different
Yes.
types of glaciers, but that potentially could be no habitat because maybe they could cross it, but you wouldn't assume an activity
True.
center
Very
in
true.
the middle of the glacier.
Very good point. Yes. There we go. Okay. Arslan is saying after 48 kilometer will be excluded from the captured individual. Sorry, I don't, not sure
Oh,
I
I think
understand.
she's talking about the buffer. So that's the second thing we'll go to now, Artsalan. So I think, sorry, I think I might have not been 100% clear. But okay, these are great for non-habitats. So the first thing is we would have our mask and we would define certain pixels as non-habitat, non-activity centers, okay? And then we have this mask. Next, we have to estimate, okay, what's our integration space within this mask, and which is, for example, our buffer, based on our buffer. So here we know potentially that the estimate, and I think that is correct, Manvi told us that the sigma of this population is around 6 kilometers. So if sigma is around 6, if you remember, Kustup showed this great histogram, and he showed that the kind of the radius of the histogram can be 2 sigmas, right, Kustup? You were sharing?
Yeah.
Which is what we want to assess. So if the histogram is there and there's 2 sigmas, then we want to at least consider a buffer of at least 2 sigmas, right? But however, our sigma is a range. It's an estimate again. And you remember that sigma estimate has a confidence interval, right? And it will vary between your snow leopard individuals potentially. So to be safe, it's good to consider 4 sigmas so that you can consider the whole range of all your snow leopard individuals, if that makes more sense. Kustub, I don't know if you want to explain again. So yes,
Perfect,
so
Justine. That's
yeah, is that? So that's why after 48 kilometers, we assume that all snow leopards that are captured in our camera trap grid are included, and all of their sigmas are included. So here it would be 6, so we would do 6 times 4. What was 6 times 4 is 24. 24 kilometers squared as a first initial buffer. And then we could run our SCR analysis, which Kustub will share how we do that. And then we can use the estimates we get of sigma of lambda of detection. And we could, he'll go into how we can then also define how accurate we want our estimate to be for our suggested buffer to get a suggested buffer. But that's great. Oh, okay, Joe has mentioned, just last comment, that snow leopards in forested areas were found in Xinjiang. Yes. I think there were several camera traps that were found, snow leopards, but I'm not sure how dense these forests were, Joe. I think they might have been just kind of forest patches, but feel free to comment. I'm not sure on the size of these forest patches. Okay. So without ado, I just wanted to add that the mask can also provide info on covariates, because you can provide information for each pixel to influence and see how these pixels influence density across your integration space. So this is where I'm going to leave it now to Kustub to go into how we do this in actual analysis in R.
sure. Thanks, Justine. That's very helpful. It kind of